Okay, so this session on 29th of October 2020, part of Ethical Consumer Week, is titled Empowering Young People in Climate Crisis. And just to summarise the event description, we're asking, are enough people listening to the voices of those aged 25 and below? So this session will ask if young people have been given enough of a voice in this fight. And it will argue that empowering young people is essential to solving this crisis, and that the climate movement, is held back when we fail to recognise diverse voices. And it'll explore how to empower youth going forward. We've got three really good speakers today, which we're really looking forward to hearing from. We're really pleased to welcome Zanira Malik, a programme coordinator at Action for Conservation, a charity that engages and empowers young people to connect with and protect the natural world. We've also got Cameron Joshi, who works at Global Justice Now, organising the youth network. He's also a core organiser of the radical youth collective Our Future Now and the climate justice direct action group Global Justice Rebellion. And finally, we've got Belle Jacobs, a former fashion editor turned activist for new systems in fashion against climate change and for animal rights. And she's the coordinator of the Extinction Rebellion Fashion Action and has spoken about animal rights at lots of different schools. So they'll be speaking in that order for about 15 minutes each, and then we'll have questions from you, the audience. So please don't forget to put your questions in as we go along in the Q&A box. And if you've got comments that are not questions, they can go in the chat box. So to get us started, Zanira, can I hand over to you?
Yeah, hi. Hi everyone, my name is Zanira, and since I sent that bio across, I'm actually program manager for the Southeast region for Action for Conservation now, which is great. So just a bit about Action for Conservation. We're a youth youth education charity that works to empower young people to protect the natural world and generation of environmental change makers. So our aim is to inspire young people from diverse backgrounds across the UK to discover the magic of nature and take action to protect it, whilst also trying to influence NGOs, businesses, schools and government to sort of involve young people in the decision making. So our programs that we run kind of vary from Wild Ed secondary schools programs to camps in national parks, and an ambassador youth program. And recently we've just developed a new digital series, which I'm going to talk a bit about. But we mentor young people to kind of take action on their own terms. So I'll be touching on sort of empowering young people and how we kind of, what approaches we use to do that. So firstly, when lockdown happened, we had to sort of pause all of our in-person engagement activities. So we really use that time to think about how we could be doing what we do better. So one of the first, our first sort of online series called Wild Web, so it's a play on words for Wild Ed, and it was like a series for young people from anywhere to join, and they had to be between the ages of 12 to 17. It was a free program, and one of the things that we kind of struggled with before, because we were quite a small team, was reach young people kind of everywhere. We had regions where we were focusing on, but obviously with the barrier of us not having to travel existing, we were able to reach young people from all sorts of places, so across the UK, but also in Ireland, in US states, Pennsylvania, Texas. We had a young person from Singapore join us. So I think we're really going to try and keep going, even if it's in a light touch way, with this online sort of outreach stuff, because I think it's really fabulous the amount of people, young people, we've been able to reach through it. So as young people can down, we use the program as an opportunity for them to sort of connect with each other, as well as learn more about environment and conservation issues and climate issues. We also had to be a bit more creative around sort of taking action for the environment, is something that we include in all of our programs and incorporate in a way that was sort of COVID friendly or safe to do from home in a socially distanced way. So it's been interesting kind of figuring that out. But so the way that we kind of ran the program was that it was themed every month, or 6-week cycle as we called them, and we tried to look at a certain topic or theme in that cycle. So we looked at food industry, the fashion industry, we looked at nature and wildlife. And one of the things we tried to actively do in this program which we might not have done in our previous programs, but something that we're taking forward now, is made the decision to consciously be intersectional where we could. And intersectional is obvious, it's heard a lot nowadays, and I think it can be a bit of a buzzword. But I'm just going to explain like the ways we did that in our programs. So for example, in our content, we had our cycles of the secrets of our food, where we explored the idea of power and privilege, and really looked at our colonial past and how it affects the way we produce and culturally see food today. So slightly different to when we talk about food and the environment, but also really, really relevant when we think about the way our food systems work. In our consumerism unpacked cycle, we looked at workers' rights and fast fashion, we looked at cultural appropriation, and we also looked at the Black Lives Matter movement and how the media was approaching sort of versus the value of like products, and how we kind of value that. I think it brought out really interesting conversations. And then in our Unearthing Nature and Wildlife series, we explored sort of unequal access to nature, varying human relationships in the natural world, and looked at who's most affected. So we tried to actively make the links where we could. And in order to do all of this stuff, we didn't do it alone. We obviously had time, and that barrier of travel didn't exist for a lot of people. So we invited experts who are working in these areas to explore these themes with us. So experts in the environmental space, maybe not in the traditional sense, but with equally important, if not more so, interesting projects connecting these issues. So for example, we invited Ian Solomon Kowal from the May Project Gardens, who combines hip hop and gardening, and works with some of the most vulnerable young people in London. Dr. Francesca Mazzarella from the Centre of Sustainable Fashion, who's developing a project around sort of working with young people and tackling knife crime using design activism. Again, like a really fresh idea, but really, really interesting for the young people. They loved it. And Chantal Lindsay from the London Wildlife Trust, who is working on the Great North Wood project in South London, and she's working with communities to kind of look at habitat fragmentation and how we can work to bring back life to the Great North Woods. So I'm not just showing off about what we did, I'm just kind of sharing ways that we try to actively be intersectional in our approach. And so that's through experts, that's for our content, and really bringing in those themes. And doing this allowed us to really talk about the most topical and pressing issues that young people are seeing every day. So on social media, on TV, and we made a point as environmentalists to not separate these issues from the rest of what is going on in the world, not to overwhelm them and like talk about everything at once, but to really connect them and look at the whole context of the world we live in. And that we should hopefully equip them to take action and think of inclusive solutions as well when we talk about environmental and climate solutions. It also allowed a lot of our young people from the different backgrounds that they are from to really talk and discuss about these issues together, and ask questions as well. I think it's really important to provide that space now, especially where we are talking about being intersectional and diverse. Like, it's really important to create that space for young people to explore what this stuff really means and talk to each other. So we'll be taking these learnings from Wild Web and adapting our Wild Ed Schools programme now, I think, as well. We're holding a climate series soon from November. And just, I think one thing we'll really try and do is look at the new perspectives that we learned from Wild Web, and bring these themes and solutions together from these intersections, and present them to the young people. I think one thing we really underestimate is how much young people know already, how much they're exploring and exposed to, way more than that we used to be. So I think they've really enjoyed it, and it's one thing that we should definitely working with young people. Okay, so I am going to talk a bit about how we actually empower or help young people like use their voices. So during our Wild Web programme, along with sort of knowledge building and facts and sharing case studies, we held a series of skill developing workshops with our volunteers who were experts on, for example, writing, photography and filmmaking. And we held competitions for young people in the programme to really put their skills to use after attending. So I just want to show you that what can be produced when young people are given the tools, expertise, knowledge, and freedom to be creative with sort of environmental messaging. So are we okay to show Ria's video, the first video? So this video that was produced was the winning video in the filmmaking competition with our young person Ria from Singapore. So I'm just gonna mute myself so you Oh, we can't hear it.
I'll just try one more time, and then if not, we'll just share a link to it.
Yeah, I can also share it on mine if that's helpful.
Buying, buying, and more buying. When bombarded with ads from your favorite fashion brands or seeing influencers promoting products that you unwittingly gravitate towards, it becomes very easy to fall into the endless cycle of buying, buying, and more buying. Fast fashion brands capitalize on the opportunity to make quick profit by constantly marketing new, low-quality clothes that may seem trendy at costs that are too good to be true. However, in trying to meet the demands of human consumption, many companies are outsourcing their labor in developing countries, often using unethical and inhumane methods to get the item to the consumer as fast as possible. With trends coming and going at rapid rates, we too are losing the incentive to take care of clothing for the long term. In addition to the human costs of fast fashion, the environment is being severely impacted as dyes leach waterways and discarded clothing degrade in landfills, releasing harmful greenhouse gases such as carbon dioxide and methane. Every year, over 22,000 tons of toxic waste from tanneries enter the waters of Bangladesh. This has cascading effects on both the civilians that rely on the freshwater reserves to survive and the wildlife who live along the riverbanks and ocean. Most of the fabrics that you use today are made of synthetic materials such as polyester and nylon, which are often manufactured using fossil fuels. Each round of washing will shed about 700,000 microfibers and microplastics, which will be consumed by aquatic organisms and move up the food chain until we humans consume them. The chemicals that are infused in our clothing also has deleterious and unknown effects on our health. This even applies to garments that are marketed as being made out of 100% natural fibers. In fact, the Greenpeace Detox campaign discovered 11 chemicals that are commonly present in our clothes production that cause cancer and disrupt our hormones. It is never too late to take action or change your personal habits. Here are some ways you can help. Put your money where your mouth is. Only support companies who enforce stringent social corporate responsibility policies. Be wary. Many companies will create sustainable lines that are only eco-friendly in name. Make sure you do not become a victim of virtue signaling. Purchase sparingly. Only purchase items when you really need them. You may also try selling or purchasing from secondhand or thrift stores as well. This not only extends the lifespan of your clothes, but you might be able to find items at reduced prices. Most clothing can be altered or repurposed. With the internet at your disposal, there are always resources online to help you out. The fashion industry may be the second most polluting industry on the planet, but it is never too late to change your habits and influence others to preserve our natural resources and environments.
Great, thank you. Yeah, so that was our winning film from the competition. So you can see how like they're able to sort of really use the skills learned from the workshops that we explored. But I think it's really nice to give them the space to be creative with it. So I'm just going to show you a really quick video, which is slightly different because all of our entries are really different. But this one was using TikTok as a platform to make videos for environmental messaging. So I think if we could just see like a minute of that video, it'll be really helpful.
Hey guys, my name is Phoebe and I'm an ambassador at Action for Conservation. I'm going to show you how to make a really easy cami top, and I'm using an old duvet set. We need to stop wasting so much fabric because one person throws away 70 pounds of clothes per year, which is huge. And so I'm just measuring myself and the duvet set. And I tried to do a quirky transition here, kind of worked, kind of didn't. So I'm hemming here and then I'm adding the elastic. I've got to pull it just to make sure it's ruffled. Looks like a really weird skirt here. I pinned and sewed on the straps, and it takes 2,700 litres to produce one t-shirt. Okay, so this is the before, and this is the after. Woo, woo. Follow for more, bye!
Great, thanks. So again, one of the things we really encourage is young people using the spaces that they're already involved in. So whether that's social media, whether it's different platforms, Instagram, TikTok, or whether it's gaming, whatever activities that they're already involved in and enjoy, we encourage the use of that to sort of take environmental action or campaign through those means. So as you can see, the creativity, it spans across sort of different I can't show you all the videos, but they're all on YouTube, if you look on our YouTube channel, but they're all very, very different, and I think that's what's really nice working with young people, is just really recognizing that everyone has a different way or a different means that they kind of choose to take action from. So one thing I like to say is that not all young people that are interested or aware of environmental issues or climate issues are see themselves as activists, and that's completely okay, because young people that we work with come from sort of, they are involved with XR all the way down to actually I just want to do photography, or actually I just want to build this garden patch and make my neighborhood green, and that's completely okay. It's just recognizing the spectrum of the different types of actions that they can take to make change, and that. So in terms of diversity and inclusivity. So we actually added diversity as an organizational value alongside our values that we had, which were hope, wonder, action, and change. And I think in a world full of biodiversity, I remember we had this conversation in like a meeting, diversity in people, where they're from, their experiences and their ideas is just as important in the sector. And as people that work, or as an organization that works primarily in areas that are sort of less affluent or more disadvantaged, however we want to talk about that, we need to make a conscious effort to understand some of the issues that those young people are then faced with every day. Like, there's absolutely no reason to kind of go in and talk about, oh, these are the issues you should be caring about, because young people have their own issues or are exposed to more local, more immediate issues, and we really need to recognize that. And one way that we can do this, so for example, we do this in our Wild Ed workshops in schools, is really talking about making those spaces available for young people to bring topics around racism, topics around sexism even, into those workshops where we're talking about conservation. And I think that's worked so well to get young people who are not disengaged, but maybe not really into it, involved, and sort of it piques their interest when talking about these issues. Another way that we do this is really allow young people to decide what is the most important issue for them to tackle first. So for example, if we've got lists from air pollution all the way down to sort of we need to get plastics out of our seas, we really see the difference in areas where we are, firstly, where they think that obviously clean air is the most pressing issue to them and they need to tackle that first, whereas some people think endangered species in different countries are sort of first priority to save, and that's completely okay. And it's making that space to show them that they can decide for themselves. There's no wrong or right answer when we talk about solutions, because all of it matters, and all of it is important, and you can be a conservationist or a climate activist in whatever way you want, and everyone, it's more of a value rather than an identity, in a way, or a work job, a profession. But yeah, I hope that makes sense. Sorry if I rambled a little bit, but yeah, I think I'm going to pass back to Ruth.
Thank you, Sunera. That was great, and really good to see the videos as well. And people can check more out on YouTube on your channel, can't they? So next up is Cameron from Global Justice Now, if you'd like to take over.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, thank you, everyone. Sunera, that was really, really cool. I think we share a lot of similar experiences with organising with young people. Okay, cool. So before I start, I haven't run through this speech. It might overrun, it might really underrun, but, bear with me. I hope it's okay. I'm also feeling a bit iffy, so I hope I get through it without, I don't know, collapsing or something, but I'm sure I'll be okay. So a little about me. So I'm 25 years old, so I consider myself a young person as well. I work at the NGO Global Justice Now, and I've been working there for about a year and a half. And what I do there is I try and organise their youth network. So that is a network of activist groups that are only for people under 30 years old who work on the same issues as Global Justice Now, which is namely Global South Solidarity. And I've been doing political activism for about 2 years now. But I've only really gone into environmentalist things in the last sort of year and a half as well. And that's because I'm not really a natural environmentalist. So like a lot of people, a lot of young people in this country, I don't really have any connection to nature. I hate camping. I don't really think about wildlife and animals very much. I'm not yet a vegan, as an example. My personal connection with nature is really lacking. I've always grown up in the middle of London. And so I realized when I saw news articles about how serious the climate crisis was getting, that there's something needs to be done. So I decided to join the environmental movement to sort of educate that part of myself that was lacking and try and do something about this. So I've mainly worked actually with Extinction Rebellion for a long time. And during that time, I was arrested 3 times in 3 different bouts of civil disobedience. And even once I got to go on the Victoria Derbyshire show on BBC. But throughout all of that, something was really missing for me as a young person. And in the years since I've been doing this activism, that sense has only really grown. But it's now a lot clearer to me. So for the next sort of 10 minutes, I'm just going to try and explain to you what that sense is, why something's off with the environmental movement from the perspective of a young person. So to talk about that, I think we really have to talk about young people. What is their lived experience? What is their perspective on the world? And from all of my friends, from the people that I meet in my job and the people that I try and organise, overwhelmingly, our lived experience is one of a world which is unfair, a world which is not built with our interests at heart, a world where many of us will never find economic security. We're the most educated generation in the world, in history, yet we wait tables and deliver food. So only over a third of young people can only get part-time work. 2/3 of all agency workers, so these are precarious workers, are under 30. I have a 32-year-old friend who's an artist, and she's 32. And yet, even with parental help, she has to work about 6 different precarious jobs, including as an agency teacher and an usher at a theatre, just to get by with her rent. I've got another friend who works as a cash in hand sort of admin person at an estate agents throughout the pandemic, and he's now lost his job because that work was totally precarious. And yet we do all this precarious labour, and yet our wages aren't enough to live on. So boomers, these people who were born in the 40s and 50s, they had 7 times the amount of wealth at age 35 the millennials will at that age. So it's not just that you know we're not doing so well economically. We're not doing very well at all compared to generations before, and our wages are lower. And as an example of that, the job I'm on now, I'm paid the London living wage, but I was one of few applicants because that is still not good enough for someone to live in London ordinarily. And that's really something to think about, because that's a well-paid activist job, an entry-level job. Another thing is it's a rarity for people at my age to have housing security. So almost half of all 16 to 34-year-olds rent privately. And many others still live at home because renting is just too expensive. We spend 3 times more on housing than our grandparents did at the same age. And yet we live in worse housing than they did. Our house prices are about 8 times the average salary, whereas they were less than half that only 20 years ago. We are half as likely to own our own home as previous generations. In fact, a third of our generation will never be able to own their own home. They all rent their entire life. I don't know anyone who has bought a home. I don't know anyone who's bought a home in my generation. And our mental health is suffering because of all this. So mental health rates have skyrocketed in young people. And we wait years to see mental health doctors because that funding has been cut. So, and almost everyone I know has had a mental health crisis at some point. And yet we are also the most diverse generation in terms of race, gender, sexual orientation. Our understanding, for example, of systemic racism is far better than previous generations. And it shows when, like, I went on the Black Lives Matter demos with loads of other young people, the vast majority of people around me were young. So there we are. We all sit as a generation that has lived experience of economic oppression, basically. And that's where our view on the climate crisis comes from. We don't view this as an apolitical thing. So overwhelmingly in my job, when I go around the country and talk to young people and try and organize them, there is a particular view of the climate crisis that comes out. And I'm going to try and spend the next half of my speech trying to give you a sense of what that perspective is that young people have. So their perspective is more about climate justice. It's not just about reducing emissions. It's not just about going to renewables or becoming or wasting less. It's about justice. So this is a radical school of thought. Radical as opposed to what? Well, it's opposed to a more normal story that we've heard over and over again in the environmental movement. And it goes something like this. Climate change is as a result of burning fossil fuels and damaging our environment. It will come soon, but we can avoid it if we switch to renewables and tweak our financial system. And we can do this if we get everybody together, and corporations will need to change, but we need to change personally as well to combat it. That's a very normal story that we hear, but climate justice tells a very different story. And a lot of it stems from one foundational realization that we are not all equally responsible for the climate crisis, and we are not all equally affected. I think that's really important. It's something I hear repeatedly from young people. So half of all emissions globally are made by the richest 10%, whilst the poorest half of the world are only responsible for 10% of global emissions. And the impacts of those emissions, they don't fall on the global north and the global south equally. They fall overwhelmingly on the global south. So huge swathes of the global south have become uninhabitable. Billions of people live in countries that are at risk of civil conflict because of the climate crisis by 2050. Countries like Syria, and all these countries are in the global south. 500 million refugees, as an estimate, are going to be created by the climate crisis just in the next few decades. And it's not happening in the future, it's happening now. And it's been a long time coming. And these systems which have generated the climate crisis as we see it have had their roots in colonialism, have had their roots in capitalism, going back hundreds and hundreds of years. So it's a systemic problem. And as an example of that, I just want to talk briefly about the Congo in the colonial period, because it shows how oppression of human beings and destruction of the environment come hand in hand in the system that we have today. So Congo in the late 19th century was a private fiefdom of King Leopold II of Belgium. And the whole point of this colony for Belgium was to extract rubber and copper. They put quotas on every single African person in the Congo. They had to produce these raw materials for the colonizers. And if they didn't, their hands were chopped off, their ears or their legs, they would be tortured, their families would be taken hostage. And in order to make the plantations to produce all of these raw materials, there was deforestation on a humongous scale that has not been recovered from even today. Throughout all that time, the population of the Congo was reduced by half. More people died there under colonialism than did in the Holocaust. And all of that was to extract wealth and bring it to the global north. Another example of this is colonial India. Over the period of colonial occupation, over $44 trillion was extracted from India and taken to the UK. So here we have a system which brutalizes people and also destroys the environment, for one thing, for profit, and to take that wealth from the global south to the global north. But the most shocking thing is this story still happens. This system is still here. So to show that, every single year, $2 trillion is taken from the global south and brought to the global north. And that's in net terms. So if you think of all of the charity and all of the aid that goes from the north to the south, this is 2 trillion more than that goes the other way. So it's the global south that develops the world. It's not the other way around. But through that, we can see that this system hasn't changed. We still have a system which is effectively modern day colonialism. It extracts wealth at a brutal cost, but it also has a brutal cost for the environment. And this is the key thing and why it's relevant to us as climate activists. So those industries which extract wealth are primarily metal, mining, and agribusiness. Those industries are responsible for half of all global emissions and 80% of all wildlife destruction. So this is the thing we have to fight. And when I go around the environmental movement and I talk to people, there's only really one group of people who do understand this, and that is young people. That's their perspective of this, is that this isn't a crisis that is siloed and by itself. This is a crisis of 500 years of our society and the way its economic incentives have been arranged and the way that we have treated other people. And so all of those things have to change if we want to move on. And if we don't tackle all of these systemic issues, we run the risk of something called green colonialism. So this is a future where we do transition to renewables, but we don't deal with any of these systemic issues. And that future is one where, because of that transition to renewables, our resource needs increase from 79 billion tons of resources to 167 billion tons in order to feed that transition. And that feeds much more land theft and mass environmental degradation in the global south, all of it to extract mining, to extract metals and minerals in order to feed this transition, all of that at the cost of the global south at the same time. We can't allow that to happen. So, you know, are movements listening to this perspective that young people have? No. I have not seen a large movement take this on at all. In fact, I've seen it be extremely difficult to get this perspective across in large movements like Extinction Rebellion, where I spent the last year and a half of my environmental organising. I've even found it, I found it fine at Global Justice Now, but that's a rarity. As a whole, the environmental movement doesn't want to deal with these problems or view it in a systemic way, but young people do. And I think that's at the root of the sort of hesitancy that Zunera is getting to at one point in her speech, which is that young people aren't actually going to engage unless they see that, yeah, no, it is really a systemic problem. Yeah, this actually links to the fact that I can't get housing, I might never be able to. Yeah, it links to the fact that I'm paid a low wage, and it links to the fact that I'm a victim of systemic racism that I see all the time. And I'm going to end with some experiences that I've had with young people. So Global Justice Rebellion is an organisation that I'm part of. We're trying to do the climate justice work that we think Extinction Rebellion should be doing, trying to marry those brilliant strategies and tactics with an analysis like this that's so popular among young people. And when we built our occupation site, I think it was October last year, surprise, surprise, the main groups that supported us were Extinction Rebellion youth, so people under 27 years of age in Extinction Rebellion, and Extinction Rebellion unis, overwhelmingly young people at university, and they came in their droves on coaches to come down and sit in rows for us and keep that site. So I thought that was brilliant. When I go across the country and do climate justice workshops where we talk about all of this, they're often oversubscribed wherever we go, whether it's Brighton or London or Liverpool, when we do it online now with COVID, etc. And wherever I go, I see young people making these connections and pushing the boundaries to make movements truly stronger and more connected. So if people aren't listening, how can they listen? How can we really empower the youth? So from what I've seen, here's how we can do it. So young people need separate autonomous organizations in order to do all this work and champion all these ideas. So Extinction Rebellion Youth, for example, is a group that's autonomous from Extinction Rebellion, and they do take on board a lot of these ideas, and you can check out their Instagram page and their Facebook page for all of that. We also need less hierarchical organizations. That's a cultural change I've seen, that young people, we organize on a more horizontal basis. We also need more political education. We need to discuss all these ideas. And that's when I've seen that young people in the Global Justice Now Youth Network, for example, are more hungry for reading clubs and political workshops and things like that than other things. But above all, we need to have an understanding of the climate crisis that intersects with social and economic justice issues. It's our only hope of solving the crisis that faces us. But I feel lucky, because the young people that I know are the most dynamic and intelligent activists that I've ever met. So if anyone can do it, we can. And I'm going to end there.
Cameron, that was brilliant, and no one would know that you were not feeling well, and I hope you feel better soon. That was really, really interesting, really, really important. Climate justice, thanks for spelling that out. And it's like, yeah, it's not just a climate crisis, it's a wider crisis of exploitation of all kinds, and they're all linked. Thank you very much. Our final speaker is Belle Jacobs. Are you ready to take over?
Okay, so we're doing, it's about 15 minutes per speaker, isn't it? Yeah. Again, a bit like Cameron, I'm sort of in half-term holiday mode, so I'm not going to be as focused as I usually am, but I'll give it a shot. Unlike the other two, Sunira and Cameron, I do not consider myself a youth. so you're having quite an adult perspective on this, but someone who's very, very driven to support young people in what I think is genuinely the biggest challenge that the human race has faced. To place myself in some kind of context, I'm a former fashion editor for Metro newspaper. I was writing madly about fast fashion for 13 years, during which time a growing sense of unease actually forced me out of that position. Rana Plaza fell, the garment factory in Bangladesh, taking 1,134 lives. And it was a moment when the fashion industry, a window opened on the true workings of the fashion industry, that it was a much darker, more exploitative place than the business of fashion wanted us to perceive. So I became very aware of this discrepancy between the fluff of fashion and the high street, you know, the fashion shows and the celebrities and what was really going on underneath. And I left my job. And since then, I've really been on quite an immense journey. My daughter was born, which I'll come back to because she had an enormous effect on me. I joined Extinction Rebellion the moment it started, because it was the only organization that I could see that was speaking to my anxieties about the climate crisis in any commensurate way. But one of the greatest anxieties I had about the climate crisis is the world that my daughter was going to grow up into. It genuinely continues to frighten and appall me, and the news gets worse and worse. So that's kind of where I came into Extinction Rebellion Fashion Action. All the while, I have an underpinning of huge concern for the animals and the wildlife on this planet. I don't know where that comes from. I don't know why I'm more sensitive to what they undergo than other people. I'm sure there's a psychologist out there who could explain it to me. But I started almost at the same time training to become a child counsellor, because my daughter made me aware of how much potential there is in children and how much I wanted to help children in trouble. But also I started school talks for animals. Now, for Animal Aid, for the charity Animal Aid. Now, the benefit of the school talks has been that I go into ordinary schools, largely in the East End, and I try and introduce kids to issues that I don't know if they've thought very much about. I think Cameron's sort of feeling about, he didn't think very much about animals. I would go into classrooms and most of the kids there, I think in these schools, hadn't thought very much about animals. So I've done about 30 of these talks, and each talk is a development on the next one. And it became very clear that I had to find some way to reach the children in order to make them see why this mattered, not just for the animals, but also for the wider world. And it became an exercise in finding communication points in which I could stimulate their interest or their empathy. And one of the things that I found very, very dramatic, two things really in the Animal Aid talks, there's so much I could say about it. The first thing is that young people have a very strong sense of ethics. And if I pointed out to them, for example, that there's something inherently unfair about exploiting another creature simply because it can't fight back, it can't speak out, it has no method of defending itself, I would feel within the classrooms certain currents of energy in a way where kids would kind of go, that's just not right. The second thing that I would really notice is that the kids did not feel, the kids in a lot of the classrooms that I was present in did not feel a sense of agency to change anything. So I remember a couple of times at the end of a talk going, this is not an easy situation, but you have the power to speak up about it. And the sense I got from a couple of classrooms was we don't. And I think it's very striking to me, that feeling that the kids in some of the classrooms, not all of the classrooms, some of the classrooms genuinely felt that they had no control over their own futures, that they had been raised in cultures where they very much had to do what they were told, that obedience was valued above all else, that they had to toe lines, restrain themselves, pull back, work according to lines that had been set for them for adults. So the schools talk has been really, really interesting for me. I continue to deliver them, but it was because of schools talk that I decided to do fashion in schools. So it's wonderful being part of Extinction Rebellion and Extinction Rebellion Fashion Action. But there's a certain sense sometimes when I go on demonstrations that I'm talking to like minds already. These aren't people, when I go out on the streets, these aren't people who need converting or informing. So I developed my program. I've only given 2, but the feeling behind them is very much the same. Once young people understand what's at stake, once they understand what has been hidden from them by the mechanisms of capitalist society, for want of an easier phrase, once they understand the complexities of the issue, once you can pique their interest to the complexities of the issue, once they see that, for example, animal agriculture and the fashion industry intersect with their lives, they become more engaged. And then once they see that they may potentially have the ability to change things, you get a potential audience of activists. It's quite an exciting moment. I can always, my talks are not simplistic. When I go in and talk about animal agriculture, I inevitably seg into ethics, as you can hear. When I talk about fashion, I inevitably seg into social justice. You cannot talk about sustainable fashion without taking on board the garment workers. It's absolutely core now. And both Cameron and Zanira were pointing out that. You cannot talk about fast fashion or fashion industry without looking at the effects of resource use, which Cameron so brilliantly talked about. And you cannot talk about fast fashion without the impact on the climate. And you cannot talk about fast fashion without saying to young people, you cannot talk about anything actually without saying to young people, the changes are coming, the changes are here for many people already, but they're coming fast. There is a challenge, I feel, as if, sometimes I get very, very depressed about what's coming. We can see it already. We're going to be in a situation, or my daughter is going to be a situation, I know, where there's going to be less foods for her. Water is going to be a necessity, more rare. She will be watching swathes of people displaced from their homes and billions dying in conflicts and in drought, millions. I don't want to put a figure on it, but there will be because we've got into trouble with this before. There will be casualties. There are casualties. There's no one can deny that. She will be in a position where she watches suffering really on a huge scale. And how do you present this information to young people without them despairing, as it is with us? This is a constant. How do you give the reality of the situation, which you need to give in order to inspire people to act, but doesn't make them feel disempowered and doesn't make them feel like, what is the point of going on? Why don't I just turn to more consumerism? Why don't I just, this kind of sense of I'll just take it all now, or I'll just, you know, how do you get them to act on that? So it's a delicate balance. But I feel very much that my work with young people is inspired by a moment when I went on the first climate strike in London, the school strike. And I remember walking into it very much as if I was on another Extinction Rebellion march. And I suddenly thought very strongly, that's not my role here. My role here is to step back and be a supporter, an enabler. This is their moment. This is the moment of the students. And so my role as not part of the younger generation is to do whatever I can to help them make informed choices or find ways through it. One of the things I tell the students now in both my animal rights talks and my fashion in schools talks is, you know, take action however you can. And I go to a quote by an amazing speaker called Dr. Elizabeth Ayana Johnson, who said, one of the failings of the environmental movement is that we do not, let me see if I can get the exact quote and read it. A failing of the climate movement is that we've been asking everyone to do the same thing, as opposed to what are you, sorry, I can't see it very well. What are you good at, and how can you bring that to this wide array of solutions? So now I say to the young people, what are your skills and how can you use them to serve this campaign to restore the planet, to prepare resilience? And I will say, you know, if you're brilliant on TikTok, create a TikTok campaign. It's very much, again, going back to what Zanera was saying, you know, enabling, giving them back the skills or allowing them to amplify what skills they already have in order to have some agency and change, which they are ready to take up. There's another quote, I think, those who wear the chains are best placed to, are in the best position to find ways to cut through them. That is a terrible paraphrasing, but the sentiment is there. The young people have this immense burden, and we must give them the tools to get through it. I'm going to stop there.
Thank you, Belle. Thank you very much. Okay, so we've had 3 really interesting talks from different perspectives, but all tied together, I think. They all sort of touched on this thing that it has to be about where the young person is and where they're coming from and their perspective on things. So in the Q&A, there are just a couple of questions. I'm going to leave a few seconds now in case people want to think up something else to ask there. But don't worry if not, because Sophie has a few questions she's collected beforehand as well. So maybe we'll just start. Well, actually, Sophie, did you want to take over?
I can. I hope you can hear me. But I suppose I'll go through the ones that are in the box first. So this one's for Zanera. How often do the Action for Conservation workshops happen?
If this is about the school workshops, so each school gets around 3 sort of structured workshops. So introducing conservation and environmental issues, then going on to exploring project work. So we the program is designed for the young people to go on the journey to end up with a project that they've actually designed themselves and they've started doing things on. So that's when, that was pre-corona virus pandemic situation. At the moment, we are doing our outreach online, and our new climate series is, you can sign up for them as like a one-off workshop if that helps. But there again, there are a series of 3, but I understand with schools and social bubbles at the moment, it's a bit difficult to commit. So that's why each workshop is a standalone workshop. But yeah, if that's helpful.
No, that's great. Thanks, Zanera. I suppose there are a few more general questions. So the other one in the chat is, for people from very closed off and not very politically aware areas, how can we connect more young people who think similarly together, especially when considering feminism and intersectionality alongside environmentalism. It's a lot of isms. So yeah, I suppose, does anyone want to go first on that one? Doesn't look like it.
Give it a
Cameron?
go. Was that my name? Sorry, I was speaking over you.
No, I was speaking over you. Yeah, it's you.
Cool. So talking to people who are not hugely politically aware is always very difficult, obviously, when you're talking about a political topic. I think we think about this slightly wrong. So we think about this on a person-to-person basis, like what arguments do I use, what do I emphasize when talking to someone who isn't politically aware? I think it's we're going to get more success if we talk in terms of what can a movement do to bring in people like that, because I think there are specific things we could do. So specific types of organizations are really good at making people who are apolitical very political, and they do that by gathering up people in a similar situation and showing them where their interests lie and what they have to do in order to get what they need. So for example, I think the best groups that do that are small radical trade unions. So an example is the London Renters Union. I worked with them for a bit. They would gather people with who are private renters with private rental sort of issues, and together they would just help each other try and solve it. And that would even go up to standing in the doorway to block bailiffs from evicting people, which worked. So when you see that happen, it creates this solidarity, and you realize that actually politics is quite important, and actually we can make a difference. And so I think environmental movements need to talk more about how our struggles are related to people who are in small trade unions like the United Voices of the World or Independent Workers of Great Britain, and to private renters who are in the London Renters Union, and reach out to groups like that. Because if all those groups are full of people who see all the connections to the climate crisis, who are very well-read, who understand all these things, so it won't be hard to make those connections. And then if that's done, if we have a movement that is environmental, that includes people from social and economic justice movements as well, then you do have, especially if those are sort of union type groups as well, then you're going to have people who are not politically aware, not only becoming aware that, as a private renter, I have to tackle issues related to landlords all the time, we can do it together, but also they're gonna learn about the climate crisis as well and how that links in.
It's a great answer. Thanks, Cameron. Does anyone have anything to add to that?
No, I thought that was really great, actually.
Yeah, that was really great. I might add one thing. I think one thing that I think can scare people off, especially if they're not at that stage yet, is just recognizing that someone's not as politically aware and then using politics to really try and get them on board. So I think a lot of it requires finding, I say this, finding common ground, finding what their values are, what they care about, and then just really using that to connect the message that you're trying to get across. Because I think there is something to that. I think we see that with young people. I used to run workshops with sort of community groups, Islamic groups, on the environment, and one thing I really enjoyed, because I come from that background as well, is just finding common ground. Okay, so what is the environmental movement saying, and what does the faith say, or what does the scripture say, and where can we make the connections? If someone is, if someone holds something close to their heart and that's how they see the world, it's just really finding the language to become more relatable, I guess. So I think movements do need to be a bit more aware around that, and understand that not everyone is on the same page. But that doesn't mean that, we kind of just leave everyone behind. It's just about really actively finding, leaving our echo chambers and finding that common ground. And it's way more worthwhile when you really do, when it connects, and when you're able to have that conversation. Yeah, I hope that's helpful.
And Belle, you've got your hand up.
Oh yeah, well, I was thinking of social groups that I'm part of. There's two social groups that I'm part of who aren't connected to these issues, and I'm sure we're all we have our activist groups and people who totally get it, and then we have other groups. And there's one group where I don't know how I will ever reach them because they don't want to hear anything difficult. And so I sort of have to sit and chew my way through that. But there's another group where I feel that these are genuinely good people who don't want to be disrupted. And so I had to spend a week with them recently, actually. And I thought, I'm not going to go in there and go, why aren't you doing this? And oh my God, do you know what you're doing? Why? I just kept it really light. So I didn't criticize, you know, I couldn't go in and go, I can't believe you're still eating meat. Oh, sorry, I'm a plant-based, I'm a vegan, but I would just sort of be, you know, I'd get a vegan meal and I go, oh my God, this is amazing. I'm like, how's your steak? You know, it's quite a delicate balance of just of showing by doing. So I was, you know, upbeat and, you know, I made clear that, you know, nature was very important to me and my daughter, but I understood that it was not quite right for them. It's really, you know, knowing that these were good people that maybe just hadn't read the same things as I had or seen the same things or I had, that were a little bit further on a slightly different part of the journey. I've also had a chat with someone where we had a huge, we had a debate about animal sentience really, and he almost really didn't believe that animals felt anything. And 6 months later, he said, I get it. And that conversation that we had was one step. He probably had to go through another 30 or 40, but that sense of we all are on a journey of learning is important to hold in mind.
They're all, again, very different answers and very good ones. And I really like what Zanera said about how, like, relating and sharing experience. I think that's really important. Just moving on, I think we've got some of our own questions. Yeah, I've met teenagers who've said that there was huge expectation on them and their generation to solve this massive crisis. So I suppose I was going to ask if you'd come across this and whether you thought you could support the mental health of young people facing climate breakdown and help them cope with the challenges of doing something about all of this, and that's just been planted on them.
I can start if no one wants to. Yeah, I agree. I think sometimes, sorry, that's my notification in the back. I think sometimes we expect too much from young people to, like, you know, and I feel this working with young people in the conservation sector, it's like this idea that they are growing up and with all these problems and we're just kind of handing them down to them, or kind of taking away their youth and saying, no, actually you should care about this. I think it's a bit of a struggle. I think showing young people that they can take action helps with the mental health aspect of it, and kind of eases some of the, oh, we can't do, it's too overwhelming, it's such a big problem, we can't do much, because there is always things that you can do. But I think for me, it's a delicate balance from, like, are we expecting young people to change this, or actually should we as adults be changing this? Should we, as organizations, as youth organizations, for the governments or for businesses to be better for the young people that we're working with? So I think it's providing that space for young people if they want it. But I think it does really go back down to sort of, with some young people, they don't even have any access to nature or green space, right? And it's about just being that pathway for them to have this experience in nature, and to just have that opportunity that a lot of other young people or a lot of people around, you know, in the country might be having. So I think for me, it's that balance of not expecting them to take action or, like, solve this issue, but also providing them pathways if they need to. One of the projects that we are working on at the moment in the Brecon Beacons is a large scale youth nature restoration project, and one of the things we do is actually work with the local farmers there, and the stakeholders and the landowners, with our youth leadership group, who are of that decision making process in sort of restoring nature in 200 acres. So I think being that kind of like intergenerational, like, work is absolutely brilliant, but we shouldn't expect young people to, like, go out and, like, change the world. I think that really does depend on, like, an intergenerational, like, approach to making change.
So it's really about the generations working together, that's what you're sort of saying. Does anyone want to add anything to that? Okay. Well, I suppose, oh, Val, yes.
Yeah, so it was really interesting. Some of the younger for those of us in the environmental movement, taking action helps you feel sane to you know, because the grief is very big and the fear. Doing something about it really gives you back some sense of power and hope. And so it was really noticeable actually when the coronavirus lockdown started. I think 3 or 4 younger members of our team really crashed quite badly because they'd been using a lot of that anxiety on the streets, you know, and me getting arrested and feeling that things were moving. And I think that the sense of staticness that the lockdown gave them, I mean, literally people were really, really upset. I think there's this Jem Bendell, you know, we have to give space for that grief as well, and we have to then find alternative ways to act, really, for all of us, not just young people.
And on the topic of sort of how much pressure is put on young people, I suppose people often sort of talk about how much the younger generations consume, kind of get the blame for this whole crisis. But if you look at the economy, housing markets, I think Cameron was talking about earlier, all that stuff, it really does feel like they're not solely responsible for this. It's sort of being scapegoated. Do you think that's the case with the climate crisis and social injustice? Cameron?
Sorry. Yeah, definitely, 100%. I think in that book, Uninhabitable Earth, it mentions that like half of all emissions ever have happened in the last 30 years. So that's half of a generation emitting half of all emissions globally. So this crisis went from like to oh shit, it's really, really bad in like one generation. So yeah, it definitely feels like young people are not to blame for this really in any way. The other thing I was going to mention was in answer to actually, I think one of the questions before, another way, so you know, and ask the question about, you know, not to put too much pressure on young people, but also how do you bring people in who aren't necessarily interested or political? Like Val said, and I definitely subscribe to this, yeah, take people to an action. If you are apolitical, I've had 6 friends who are all apolitical. I told them it was a great day out, let's go to like one of the first Extinction Rebellion blockades. They loved it. And that was one of the things that really, a few of them, one of them is still in it, is now joined Extinction Rebellion in that week and is still in it. Others have become more political since. And it wasn't reading that got them through that, it was seeing and sensing a type of collective power that you don't really sense anywhere else. Because there's lots of people coming together, but also coming together for something socially good. And yeah, and if you're yeah, I mean, there's also a pressure to tell young people to go to things, just go to things for fun. And, you know, the pressure sort of goes and, you know, you go, like Belle said, for your own sanity. I think that's one way to sort of do it. And also there's loads of other things like, you know, like community gardening, gleaning, all those sorts of things that I've, as someone who's got a real separation with nature, not really ever done, but I've noticed lots of people really do get a lot of good out of that, whether they're political or not.
Interesting. Thank you, Cameron. That's a nice contribution. And Belle, were you going to say something before? No. Okay. I suppose, although you highlighted that young people are not to blame, I wholly agree with that. But I suppose there are lots of young people that, I don't think it's just young people either, but there is an increasing pattern of consumption. And I think, but what about education? I suppose a lot of kids, this isn't reaching kids in school. I wondered if you had an opinion on that.
So yeah, so sorry. So I do, you know, often the Too Fashion in Schools talks, you know, I'm talking to audiences of some of them I can tell are pretty into Boohoo and Primark. And so what we do is I start to say, where is your desire coming from? Why are you wanting to buy so much? And then we start to look at different elements of how media campaigns by fashion brands work on their psyche. So I'll say to them, look at this amazing ad. And then I'll explain that fashion companies have millions of pounds to spend making them, these ads create worlds in which you want to participate, you want to be part of, but the only way you're ever going to do that is by buying the item of clothing featured in that ad. So we look at things like that. We look at the actual mechanisms, the bare bones of how fashion marketing works to create desire. Then I will also point out to them that desire means that you're continually never happy with what you already have. So then I talk to them about ideas of mental health, you know, that the fashion industry drives through these doctored images, a sense that you are not good enough and that you can only be good enough if you look like this person or if you have what this person is wearing. So I really try and go behind the bare bones. Sorry, take me back to the original question.
I think it was just asking about whether we should have more education in schools.
Yes, I mean, we should.
That's sort of your area, I suppose.
Well, I mean, that's exactly right. That's what I wanted. I wanted kids to strip away, you know, all the gloss. And that's why I started fashion in schools. And also the EAC Environmental Audit Committee Fixing Fashion Report recommended that we should be going into schools and not just telling kids about the industry, but giving them back the tools in which they can customize their clothing, mend their clothing, revalue their clothing, and ask themselves exactly where has this clothing come from? Absolutely, we need to reach young people because they are the potential big consumers of the future. And there's a really amazing quote by Chomsky, which I really love. You cannot control your own population by force, but it can be distracted by consumption. And I always, I love that quote because I think a lot of people are distracted by consumption.
That's a great quote. Yeah, thanks for sharing. Did anyone else have anything to say on education?
I can have a go. I think to flip it around, there's also a lot of things we can learn from young people. So there's a lot of things there's a lot of situations that need, you know, young people teaching other generations in the climate movement about. Yeah, especially like, you know, whenever I mention like systemic racism and how it's connected to the climate crisis in Extinction Rebellion, it was like, you know, everyone was like, maybe most of them agreed, you know, maybe a lot of them didn't really know much about it, but most of them also thought that, no, like it's just going to make us unpopular. That's sort of that's the mindset of someone from the 90s and 2000s, where you had a political consensus that stretched all the way from the left to the right in party politics and in the media. And you had this very strong sense of what is popular and what isn't. And right now that's all up in the air. And, you know, even people from the Labour Party under Corbyn, they were saying the same thing, that, you know, we shouldn't talk down policing in this country, we should talk about increasing policing. And yet it was that very movement that was ignored because people thought it was unpopular that became the largest, you know, global mobilization of 2020. That we had a huge march under COVID lockdown of 200,000 people stretching all across London about systemic racism. And the young people were right on that all along. So there's a lot of things that we can learn, you know, from them, from their personal experiences. And yeah, I definitely completely agree. There should be more climate education in schools. But in the movement, if we can put young people in a position where they can teach us more, I think we'll benefit.
Thanks, Cameron. There was another Q&A in the chat. Actually, Zinara, sorry, did you want to add something? I think you did.
I think just one of I was just going to flag that there's a great campaign called Teach the Future that is campaigning to reflect like the severity of the climate crisis and reform the education system. But also there's other campaigns like decolonize our education system. So there's a lot of these campaigns that are happening. But I think what we really need to do is look at the educational system as a whole, not just to reflect like the climate crisis, but just the whole systemic issues that we're in. And I think this is the time to do it, because I think if we just focus on one at a time, it's just never going to happen. So what we really need to do is just combine all these campaigns and look at the educational system as a whole. Otherwise, it's a missed opportunity. You're not going to keep picking at this education system. You know, if now's the time you're going to make that change, it needs to include what the movement is talking about, what we're all talking about and care about. So that's my point on sort of educational system. But I guess until that happens, we can still go and do things externally as much as we can on the education front.
Thanks. I suppose that addresses that climate justice thing again. It's social justice, and it's more than just the environment. And Cameron, I know you spoke a lot about this in relation to young people. Yeah, do you think this is something that older people really don't have? Because I suppose Belle was quite aware of it, and ethical consumer, not everyone's my age, I suppose, and they're very aware of it.
Yeah, I think there's a bit of nuance I've got to add, but that nuance would be that that I think it depends on the generation. But from what I found, people who are older than me in general are either the majority are either sympathetic or supportive, but their understanding of what's possible is very different. I think it relates to what I explained before about people who've grown up in a time when it was quite stable what was possible and what wasn't politically at the moment. Whereas now it's really not. We're living in like a once every 30-year cycle of political change. But this isn't just going to be a once in a 30-year thing, because now we have the climate crisis. These cycles might get worse and worse and worse. It doesn't mean there's more and more opportunities for change. And I think, there's a lot of hope there as well in the way that young people talk about the climate crisis. Like when I went to the first youth strike, I had my mate there who remembers the student protests back in the early 2010s. And she cried because she had never seen the same energy until the youth strikes of 2019. And all the placards were talking and connecting social justice to environmental justice. And it wasn't just because they believe in it, so they put them on the placard. In their part of the population, this is popular. This is the best way to build a movement, is to link all of these issues and link all these groups. So, whilst other people, a lot of people in the movement might agree and might not know much, but might be sympathetic, they don't, their understanding of is it possible is totally different. I wanted to comment on something else, which was just that someone mentioned in the chat that older people have been way too selfish and consume too much, and they're saying they feel so sorry and sad to have let us all down. I don't know, that's not the way I think about it. It's not our fault as young people or old people that we are born into a society where to get food, that food necessarily has to come from destroying the planet or be flown halfway across the world. Like, it's not our fault that, in order to go vegan 20 years ago was an extraordinary amount of effort that not a lot of people could do. Like, I think we have to accept that we can't all be absolute eco warriors. A lot of this change has to happen systemically. Why can't it just be easy for us to have easily accessible food products that don't come at that cost? It's not that the technology isn't there. It's that the economy that we have finds it more profitable to do the opposite. So that's the thing we need to focus on, and we don't need to feel guilty. We've all been born into this system. We didn't ask to be here, but it's time we can change it.
Thanks, Cameron. That was really good. Anything to add from anyone on that? I suppose moving on, people often see the environmentalist movement as a white middle class thing, and I think it's been like that for a long time. I wondered, is this reflected in the younger generation, or are young people a group that sort of defy that perceived norm? Maybe it's a tricky one. Maybe it's not answerable.
I almost need to hear it again. Sorry, Sophie.
Sure. Yeah, it was just I think the environmentalist movement, a lot of people perceive it as and they're always sort of calling it out for being a white middle class thing.
Yeah.
It's usually people that aren't part of the movement that say that, in all fairness. But I wondered if, you know, working with young people, if they defy that sort of what people perceive that to be, and if things are sort of changing, like the image of environmentalism is changing as time goes on, I suppose.
I think it is. I think, you know, the schools I go into are one issue, but like Cameron said, XR youth and the young people I've spoken to in the Extinction Rebellion movement are more sussed and aware of the interconnectedness of issues than, I mean, I can't believe their wisdom, to be honest. So yes, I think the environmental, Cameron might have a different opinion, but I actually see it as shifting to a more, what's the word? Holistic view, that you cannot fix one thing if everything else is going to pot. You have to look at the whole system of exploitation that we're currently running on. I come back a lot to compassion and empathy. But yeah, I do think it's changing. The reason it was white and middle class is that white and middle class people have the space to worry about these things. You know, if you're, you know, literally on poverty wages, you can't go, well, I'm going to take some time out and campaign to save the environment. So there's a reason why it was white and middle class, and it has to be a conscious effort to address that. But I honestly believe that some of the most involved youth really are conscious about it. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. I think young people, and we see this in the youth climate strikes as well, they're more sort of talking about the system, they're talking about systemic racism, they're talking about these things much more, they're less afraid to bring this, you know, to be unpopular. So maybe whereas this conventional, the traditional environmental movement, which I would say I'm a part of, and I agree, I think it is very white middle class. I think these conferences are usually very white, very middle class, and I feel like we always talk about the same issues at every conference, and we've been doing it for like 10 years. I haven't been around in the movement for that long, but I feel like that's what's happening. But I think young people are more sort of urgent in terms of taking action. I think a lot of organizations were saying a lot of the same things, but when this year, when we really saw the Black Lives Matter movement pick up, that's when we saw organizations actually taking things a bit more seriously and looking within themselves and thinking, okay, well, we do need to make change. But it's the same stuff that we've been discussing in conferences. So I think in terms of urgency, young people are way more aware, way more woke, way more urgent and honest about the issue, and less afraid to be unpopular. So I think that's changing. I think personally with the young people that we work with, we see interest across all backgrounds, and I think really creating that space for them to say what they want and say that's okay. You can bring in different issues, it's all connected. That's what's actually going to change and make that change happen. So that's my take on it.
Yeah, I might wanted to add as well. I agree that it is shifting. So, for example, looking at Extinction Rebellion's mobilizations, each mobilization has had slightly more people of color at it. I stress slightly. This is a city, you know, London is a city which is half people of color, and there'll be like 6 people out of 50 in XR demonstrations that people of color. So it's still really bad, but it is definitely shifting. And lots of people in XR, especially since the Black Lives Matter protests, have seen that they should and can make systemic racism, for example, part of their narrative. But I think, you know, there is a bigger systemic problem that people of color are less connected to nature. And it shows in polls about this issue. And I'm not sure why, but I'm definitely one of those people, obviously, as I've said, you know, several times. I think part of it might be that, like, if our ancestors are migrants, people who come to cities, I don't have grandparents who live in the countryside of the UK. Whereas in the UK for the past 100 years and before, lots of people's families had to move from the rural areas to the cities, and they might have family links in rural areas, which give them, an introduction to and a connection to nature, which I don't have and many others don't have. But another reason is environmental racism. So working class neighbourhoods of London might have less green spaces. They also, if they're working class and predominantly people of colour, they might have even less because of the effect of specific instances of environmental racism. You can see it in air pollution. So if you look at air pollution and who's exposed, if you are Black British, you are statistically more likely, even if you account for class, to be exposed to air pollution. So I'm sure it happens in access to green space as well. But yeah, like the environmental movement is really white and middle class. Like I think I'm extremely middle class. That's the reason why I have the time to do activism. And a lot of working class people don't have that time, but also so is the rest of the activist movement, which I guess isn't making us feel better about the point. But most groups that I know of do have this problem. And I think, working with unions and groups that reach out to more apolitical working class people does make, that difference. And I have one more thing I wanted to say, but I think I'll leave it there, yeah.
Thanks all, those are really poignant comments. I'm glad that, you were all able to answer so extensively on that. It's quite nice. We've had in the Q&A, someone said, Helen said, could young consumers be connected with producers more with aid of modern technology? Example, who made my t-shirt? Basically make it more personal. Does anyone want to address that?
Yes, I mean, I don't think it needs to be the aid of modern technology, though. The moment I saw that, I thought, actually, yes, maybe I could connect a classroom of students to some trade union representative that I know in India. It can be a lot. I did it with a group of 11-year-olds where I said to them, I just asked everyone to look at the labels on their t-shirt, and then we read what the labels were. And a lot of kids were saying, okay, my t-shirt's polyester. Well, where is polyester coming from? And we looked at the sources of polyester, and then they would say, well, my t-shirt's been made in Bangladesh. And I go, haha, Bangladesh. Now let's look at, the people who could be making that t-shirt. So it doesn't need to be technology, but I definitely think young people and people in general really need to be connected to the natural resources that have gone into making their clothing and who has made their clothing. So that you actually do look down at a cotton t-shirt and think about the cotton and the 2,700 litres of water it's taken to make that single white cotton t-shirt or that cotton t-shirt. Yes, people need to connect to everything, and it's not just clothing. They need to connect to where, the minerals in their phone has come from, and they need to visualize where those minerals are coming from. Are they coming from, young children in Congo who people really, really need to understand where everything has been made and who is making them.
Anyone else on that? Or any final thoughts, anything you'd like to share with the participants? I'm just wary, we've got a couple of minutes left of this session. Cameron.
Just one more thing, which was the thing I forgot to say, which is just that, speaking from personal experience, another reason people might look at the environmental movement and think, why would I join that? And I've spoken to lots of people who think the same, is because of all the things in the world to, really feel upset about. Sometimes people look in from the outside and go, isn't that weird just to be really upset about like plants and animals? Like thinking about, the Iraq war, or, coups in the global south, or billions of people starving, going hungry, the Syrian civil war. People look at us and go, this is bizarre though. Why would the one thing I care about be, I don't know, farming dairy? And that's fair. I don't think it's obviously not true. We all come to different like issues just based on often random things. It doesn't mean we don't care. But yeah, I just want to end with saying, people people who would otherwise join our movement don't see why we don't connect with other issues like racism, like the struggle of working class people, like the way the global south is exploited. They don't see why we don't connect with those issues. So I think, if we did, a lot more people of color would join our movement, a lot more people from various backgrounds. And I think that's one of the most important things we could do as environmental activists.
I suppose that applies to young people quite prevalently as well. Any other last thoughts?
Just a quick hopeful one in that case. The solutions are out there. They're just not being funded. So we really do need to challenge why that's not the case, why they're not being funded. And also I always come back to it, compassion and empathy for all other beings, human and non-human, is going to take us forward to a more equitable future.
I suppose it's something that everyone should be able to access because these things are free. It's just about, as Zanera mentioned earlier, getting people to relate on that issue, and we need to find a way forward for that. I'll let Ruth wrap up now, just because we're on over time, which I'm sorry for. Handing back to Ruth.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you everyone for a really valuable session. Some of the comments will help inform future conferences. Thank you especially to the speakers, Zanera, Cameron, Belle, but also everyone in the audience for all your questions and comments. One of my favourite things that I'm going to take away is that idea that our ideas of what is possible can be limited, and we need to think bigger than that. If you've got any particular feedback on what you think made this session work well, or any ideas of improvement or additional things you'd like us to do, please make a note of it, because we'll be sending an evaluation link round by email after the end of this week, and it's really useful to get your feedback for future events. And if there's any action you've been inspired to take as well, note that down, because we would like to hear about that in the evaluation as well. I think Zanera mentioned May Project Gardens at the beginning, and just for anyone who wants to know, they're actually doing a session tomorrow morning at 10 a.m. And I wondered if Zanera, you'd like to give a last reminder, a bit of detail about the Youth Cafe tomorrow night before we finish.
Yeah, so the young people that we've been working with on our Wildfire programme have basically taken all their learnings and designed a youth cafe, so a networking session just for young people from the ages of 13 to 19. So if you know any young people in your networks or family, friends, please do let them know about it. It's the last session of the week, so it can be found on the Friday bit on the website. But yeah, Youth Cafe, it's led and designed and led by the young people, and it should be really interesting discussing these issues, but also next steps for young people.
Thank you. Someone just asked in the chat if they have to pay. Definitely they don't, do they? It's not part of the
free session.
Yeah.
I think it's completely free. You just have to be in that age group. You could be from anywhere in the world if you want. But yeah, it should be really good. They've been working really hard on it, so it should be nice. So please do share. Excellent.
Thank you. So that brings us to the end of this webinar. Thank you everyone once again, and I hope to see you in another session soon. Bye bye.